So I think it's a pretty common misconception that in order to get into a school like Harvard or Stanford, you have to have cured cancer, have won a Nobel Prize, or have been some sort of Olympian. Now, while I will say that having these activities definitely will help you get into these schools, honestly, I think having any one of them on your resume would definitely skyrocket your chances of being admitted, if not automatically admit you into one of these schools. But I don't think that you necessarily have to have any of these activities in order to get into a top university. I mean, I went to Stanford and I definitely didn't cure cancer or win any Nobel Prizes, although it definitely would have helped my chances of admissions. In reality, I don't think there's really any sort of fixed set of activities that you have to have done in high school. Like there isn't some sort of checklist of extracurricular activities that you have to cross off in order to get into a top ranked school. Really, there are any number of paths that you can take in order to get admission into these schools, because students can have all sorts of different interests. I think at these schools, you're probably not going to find any two students who did the same exact activities in high school, which kind of just goes to show that you can really do whatever you want in terms of extracurricular activities. And so while there isn't a fixed checklist of activities, I think it can still be pretty useful to hear examples of extracurricular activities from students that go to these schools, just to get a sense of what activities might be useful for getting admissions there. And so today I'll be sharing the extracurricular activities that help me get into multiple schools in the Ivy League, as well as schools like Stanford. On the Common App, which is where students are going to be doing the applications for most of their schools, you can list up to 10 extracurricular activities, and most people rank them in order of how important they were to them, with the first activity being the most important and their 10th activity being their least important. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be starting at the bottom of my list and then working my way up to the top. For my first activity, I served on the City of Salem Youth Commission as their clerk. So my city's youth commission, you can kind of think of it as like student government, but for the entire city. So it had students from high schools all across the city, and we gathered together and just met kind of like a student government would. In our meetings, we would talk about different initiatives that we could start in our city to really help the youth. Some of the things we did included having canned food drives, starting a Christmas donation campaign, starting an anti-tobacco campaign in schools across the city. And in my role as clerk, I was really just responsible for taking notes during the meetings. I didn't really have any other sort of really big role in that committee. Honestly, I would say this was definitely one of my lower impact activities throughout high school. I did it from grades 10, 11, and 12, and our meetings were honestly probably only once every 2 weeks for about an hour at a time. So all in all, I would say that I really didn't do that much in this activity, and that's why it was at the bottom of my list. For my next activity, I worked as an altar server at my local church. This was something that I had been doing since honestly probably around 6th or 7th grade. So it had been around 6 or 7 years by the time I started doing my college applications, but on those applications you can only list from grades 9 to 12, which is what I did. And that was something that I did for an hour every week for basically the entire year, every year. And in this activity, I was really just responsible for helping the priest and deacon run mass, doing whatever little odd errands they had me do to just make things run smoothly. For my next activity, I did a community service project with a local nonprofit called Bagong Kulturang Pinoy. This nonprofit essentially worked to help set up youth libraries in areas across the Philippines, especially in rural and low-income areas. A big part of my role in this activity was volunteer work in the form of every couple of weeks meeting up to pack books in these giant boxes to be sent to areas across the Philippines to help them support those libraries. In addition to that, we would try to ask for book donations from local schools and libraries just so that we could have a bigger supply of books to send. This was something that I had been doing for a couple years in high school already, and so in my senior year, I decided to do my capstone project on my work with this nonprofit. I'd say this was definitely one of my more impactful activities because a lot of the colleges that I applied to had supplemental essay questions that asked about my work with community service and volunteer work, and for most of those essays, I was able to write about my experiences and volunteer work with Bagong Kulturang Pinoy. For my next activity, I was on the executive council of my school's chapter of the National Honor Society. I think in most schools, National Honor Society isn't really seen as some sort of really impressive activity because everyone does it, and when you're in National Honor Society, you actually don't really do that much. This was honestly kind of the case in my school too, because I don't think we really did too much as a National Honor Society, but one thing that we did do was to start a tutoring program in our school. So essentially members of National Honor Society would help tutor kids in lower grades who were struggling in their classes. And I'd say that over my 2 years in National Honor Society, that's kind of all we did. As a member of the executive council, which was just a group of 4 students who led those meetings, we kind of just talked about nothing pretty much. I think in a lot of cases, National Honor Society is really just a fluff activity that people add to their resumes. And this was kind of true for me, which is why we wanted to try to do something else by having that tutoring program. I think National Honor Society is supposed to be more community service oriented, but in a lot of cases, nobody really does anything. So National Honor Society was definitely one of my lower impact activities out of the 10 that I listed on my activities list. So for my next activity, I listed that I was a leader on my track and field team. I was on varsity track and field for all 4 years of high school. I typically did shorter distance events, so like 100, 200, sometimes 400, sometimes 4x1, sometimes 4x4, sometimes long jump. I was kind of all over the place because our track team was pretty small. And even then, I never ran the fastest and I never jumped the farthest. But one thing that I did try to make a point of in my application, specifically in my activities list, was listing what I was able to accomplish in this activity. Because I never had too many accolades, like I never won at states, I never ran at states either. But one thing that I did try to do was serve as some kind of mentor figure or some sort of leader to the younger runners who were underclassmen that didn't have as much experience in track and field as me. So I would help them with their running form, giving them tips on their diet and stuff like that. And so on my applications, I listed that I was a leader, which is kind of an informal role, but I do think that it encapsulated well what I tried to do in my time with that team. I will say that I was nominated as captain in my senior year, but our season was completely cut because of COVID, and I had already applied to colleges by then, so I didn't have the captain title for my college applications. So I think this goes to show that you don't have to have formal titles for your activities in order to show that you had some sort of impact in them. Because I think that's really what's important for your activities at the end of the day, to show that you had some sort of impact in those activities. And you don't have to have some sort of fancy title in order to do that. For my next activity, I was co-captain of the men's varsity cross-country team. Like with track and field, I was on varsity cross-country for all 4 years of high school, and again, I was never the fastest runner. But where I did lack in not having the fastest legs on the team, I did try to make up for it in bringing that kind of leadership quality to the team, which I think is what helped me be nominated as a captain in my senior year. And in that role, I was responsible for being a leader on the team in more of a formal capacity. So I would help lead practices, I would help underclassmen improve their running form, I'd give them advice on diet and nutrition and things like that. And in my senior year, we did come second in our state championship, which was really exciting, and that was definitely something that I put on my applications. For my next activity, I was team captain of the quiz bowl team as well as the quiz show team. Both of these activities were pretty similar, so I just grouped them together in one on my college applications since I couldn't list more than 10. So in my role as team captain, I would help run practices where we were just going through practice questions. I was also responsible for a lot of the logistics in terms of going to competitions, and I also served as like the leader or sort of like point of contact whenever we were at those competitions. So Quiz Bowl was something that we only started at my school in my junior year, so I was sort of a founding member of that team. Given that our team was so small and so new, I think we did pretty well overall at our competitions. We were able to qualify for the NAQT Small School Nationals, which is the national competition for schools that have a small student population. And I think I also placed 5th in terms of individual scores at one of our competitions. And this was all in my senior year, which meant that we ended up not going to Small School Nationals because our season got cut because of COVID. So in addition to the Quiz Bowl team, we also had the Quiz Show team, which was essentially the same exact people, but we were competing for a different competition. So in Massachusetts, we have this thing called High School Quiz Show, which is kind of a mix between Jeopardy and Family Feud kinda, and it's on PBS. And in order to get into the show, we had to go through a qualifying round of competitions. If you kind of think of it like the NBA, where you have the playoffs, there are the teams that make the playoffs, but there are also the teams that have to do the play-in. My team qualified for the play-in. And so before we got to go on TV, we had to first go through a separate qualifying competition. And this competition was actually hosted by Jeff Kinney, who is the author of Diary of the Wimpy Kid. And so that was pretty cool. And so we did end up winning that qualifying competition and then going on to the TV show, where we got out in the first round. But it was still a really cool experience and definitely something I talked a lot about in my applications, specifically for the supplemental essay questions that asked me to elaborate on one of my extracurricular activities. For my next activity, I was team captain of our school's History Bowl team. This is pretty similar to Quiz Bowl, but specifically for history, and there's a whole separate competition for it. This was something that was already well established in my school by the time I got there, so I was able to do it for all 4 years of high school. When I was in 10th and 11th grade, we were able to qualify for the national competition in Washington, D.C. And while we didn't do super well at the national competition, it was still really cool to be able to just say that I went there. It was definitely a highlight of my application. And in my senior year, I was nominated team captain, where I had pretty similar responsibilities as I did in my Quiz Bowl team and Quiz Show team, mostly because it was the exact same group of people. And then again, we ended up not going to the national competition in my senior year because it was cut due to COVID. For my next activity, I was student body president of my school's student government. This was something I did for all 4 years of high school, as well as part of my time in middle school. This was something that I really enjoyed. The structure of student government at my school changed basically every year. Some years we elected a representative from every homeroom. Some years we only elected a representative from each grade. In any case, I was elected to student government for all 4 years of high school, and in my senior year, I was elected student body president. And I think student government or student council or ASB is pretty similar at every school. We were responsible for planning all sorts of events, whether it be dances, fundraisers, pep rallies, that kind of thing. And I think besides track and cross country, student government is really what took up the bulk of my time in high school. And I really enjoyed my time in student government, and so I ended up doing something similar when I was in college. For my last activity, I would say that this was definitely the most important activity that I did throughout all 4 years of my high school career. This was definitely the most important activity that I put on my college applications because it formed the very foundation of my approach to my applications. This was also the most important activity I did in terms of my growth and development as a person, and I can confirm that this was definitely the activity that got me into the schools that I got into. If I didn't do this activity, I would not have gotten into Stanford or any of the schools in the Ivy League. This activity is called the National Security Language Initiative for Youth, or NSLY for short. This is a study abroad program backed by the United States State Department that sends high school students to countries all across the world to learn critically important languages to foreign relations. And for me, I wanted to study Korean, so I applied and was accepted into their South Korea program. And for that, I ended up studying in Jeonju, South Korea for about 6 weeks with 19 other high school students from all around the country. During my time in the program, we studied the Korean language, Korea's history, culture, politics, and our classes were taught basically entirely in Korean, which was really difficult for a group of high school students who had basically no experience with the Korean language prior to that. So it was definitely a really challenging experience, but I think because of that, we ended up learning the Korean language a lot faster than we would have otherwise. This program was also really big for my development just as a person because it was really the first time I had lived away from my family for so long. I was living with a host family who didn't speak perfect English, so there was definitely some language barrier between us, but even then we were still able to form a really close relationship. And it was that relationship with my host family, specifically my relationship with my host brother, that became the focus of my Common App personal statement. And honestly, besides all the growth and learning I went through during that program, I just had so much fun while I was there. I ate a lot of great food, I made a lot of great friends that I still talk to this day, and that program is actually where I started my first YouTube channel, and so the very foundations of this YouTube channel is based on my experiences in that program. So without that, none of this would have been possible. So if there's any one thing that I want you to take away from this video, it's that you should definitely apply for this program. Even if you don't have that much interest in foreign language or international relations, this program is so cool and there's so much you can gain from it. I talked about NSLY in basically every part of my application, including my interviews, so I think this is really the thing that got me into all the schools I got into. And maybe it could do the same for you. As I mentioned, I went to Stanford University, and I originally applied as a linguistics and international relations major, which kind of goes in line with a lot of the activities I did throughout high school, especially NSLY. And I think that a big thing that helped me be successful in the whole college application process was being intentional in how I listed the activities on that list. And by that, I mean that because the majors that I applied as matched the activities that I did in high school, I think that showed to admissions officers and the schools that I was applying to that I had at least some sort of idea of the direction I wanted to take, even if it wouldn't end up being the ultimate direction that I went in. I think it was really good for me to show that level of intentionality because it showed that I already kind of knew what I wanted to study because I was exploring those topics at a deep level already. So I think that ultimately, no matter what it is that you want to study, your activities that you put on your college applications should match what you want your major to be. So if you want to study computer science or mechanical engineering or English literature when you're in college, you should have activities that you did in high school that could match that major, because it won't make a whole lot of sense to apply as a biology major if all the activities that you did in high school relate to history, for example. I think it's just about showing a level of intention in terms of what activities you want to do and what major you want to study. And like I mentioned at the beginning, there isn't a fixed checklist of activities that you have to do. You don't have to do the same exact activities that I did in high school, and even if you did, you still might not get into the same schools, because everyone has their own path to take depending on what their interests are for what they want to do in high school as well as what they want to do in college. So really, I think you can do whatever extracurricular activities you want to do in high school as long as they're about something that you're interested in and you're pursuing them at a deep deep enough level to be able to show colleges that what you want to study makes sense for what you did in high school. And if you want any more advice for your college applications or for school in general, be sure to check out some of the other videos I have on my channel.